Hi friends, it's that most wonderful time of the year, Halloween, and I wanted to celebrate. But it's 2020 and we can't go anywhere. So since I have a channel and it's devoted to costumes, I thought I would do a video about an iconic costume related to Halloween. What costume shall I talk about?
I'm just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania.
Now, a brief note on the word queer. So the word itself means different from the norm, and it's been used to describe people who aren't heterosexual for almost as long as there's been a word for heterosexual. And even from the beginning, there was a sense that it was okay to use in community to say we are different from the norm, but takes on a different connotation when people outside use it to say you are not normal. And in the 80s and 90s, there's a big push to reclaim it. However, some people have heard it too many times in hate, and they are not comfortable with the usage. And if that's you, I hear you. I still choose it for myself, and also in academics, it's used for queer theory.
Queer theory is a set of academic theories and practices intended to critically examine the norms Western society has around gender and sexuality, and specifically to challenge the heteronormative assumptions our society is imbued with.
How Frankenfurter feeds into that, we'll see. So much for my choice in language. Now let's get back to this costume. Okay, from the top, we got big hair with sideburns, makeup, pearls, a sparkly corset-like top, fingerless gloves, knickers, a garter belt, and fishnet stockings, and a fabulous set of platform heels. Iconic. On first glance, you'd call this drag, and you'd be right. But this is not traditional female impersonation drag, where an assigned male at birth person dresses and performs to appear as an idealized vision of femininity. If you look closely, there is no contouring, no padding, no attempt to create the shape associated with the feminine. And there is no denying that this body was probably assigned male at birth. And nowadays, it's not uncommon to call this kind of drag genderfied. It's a direct challenge to the supposed binary nature of femininity and masculinity. To quote Drag Race winner Sasha Velour, gender is a construct, tear it apart. So that's this costume. Supposedly feminine signifiers on an obviously male body. But when we're talking about media, we have to look not just at the costume itself, but the costume in the context of its story. So what is the story here?
I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
This story begins in the most heteronormative of all settings, a straight wedding. And it begins with our supposed, according to the credits, hero, Brad, proposing to his girlfriend, Janet. Brad and dammit Janet are the perfect embodiment of the gender binary norms. Brad is what I like to call the default dude. Cis, hetero, able-bodied, white, male. The ideal square-jawed, all-American guy. Looks like Clark Kent or a Ken doll. And there are all these expectations that come along with that. Default because this is what our culture centers as normal. And next to him, Janet is default girl. She is the feminine counterpart and mate to default dude. And there's a whole bunch of expectations that come with that. And they are set up to be the breeding pair, made to breed more default people. Traditionally, our culture centers this as normal, and everything that's not that is othered. Or in a monster story, made monstrous. But this isn't the traditional story. This is a loving parody of those stories. And so when our default duo, get lost in a storm and find themselves at the monster's castle. What greets them is not a traditional monster. It is Frankenfurter. And you see, in traditional monster stories, monsters are a threat because they embody weirdness and opposites. And the point of the story is for the hero to overcome, to beat the monster and re-establish the dominant order of things. But again, not a traditional story. And so we have Frankie, Frankenfurter, gloriously, unapologetically queer. And he's charming, and he's seductive, and he's shameless. And our little default duo are totally seduced by him, have their minds opened, even wind up in his clothes, and they love it.
I feel sexy.
And though Frankenfurter is dispatched at the end of the film, it's not by our hero. And these two are by no means a representation of the heteronormative or the old order. And really, when we watch this film, the hero to us is Frankenfurter. And we are seduced by him. He's so much fun. And at the end of the film, our little default couple, our little hetero couple, are not so hetero. The old order hasn't been reestablished. Everybody's still in fishnets.
Lost in time and lost in space and meaning.
So that's this costume in this story, but let's widen the focus a little more and look at the costume and the story in the context of our culture. And this is where I come back to the idea of the default dude, because this is what our culture centers around. This is not just a factor in fiction. Because this is what our culture constructs as normal, and everything else is treated as other. Everyone who doesn't look like this is seen as weird or ugly. Everyone who doesn't love like this is seen as weirds. Everyone who doesn't dress in the right way is seen as odd. It goes on and on. Every woman who doesn't thread this exact needle. And when you are an other, every interaction with culture requires being as like the default as possible, or as palatable to the default as possible. There's various names for this experience. To shrink yourself, to leave out the messy bits that don't fit. And it sets up a tension between authenticity and respectability, between being yourself and fitting in. And oh boy, is this a big idea that I am just touching the outer edges of. And when we think about LGBTQ folks particularly, we gotta remember that most are born into straight families and communities, many of which may not be so accepting. And so there may be very little escape from this tension. They may not even know that it's possible to escape from this tension. But then they can go to a late night showing of Rocky Horror and see somebody not feeling the tension. Because Frankenfurter does not care about respectability in the least. He is completely and utterly authentic. And that is really freeing to see.
Don't dream it. Be it. Don't dream it. Be it.
Not surprisingly, when Rocky Horror Picture Show came out in 1975, it flopped. People were not ready for any of this. But some people were. And so it became a cult hit. And it was on late night showings, and rented on VHS in people's basements. And people started to dress up. Started to make this a community thing. This is probably one of the safest ways for someone who is assigned male at birth to try out heels and stockings and makeup in a public setting. There's no telling over the years how many closets creaked a little bit open with a showing of Rocky Horror Picture Show. And not just closets, it opens minds. It challenges our inherited ideas about how gender and sexuality is supposed to be done. Because here's the thing, even if someone fits any, or indeed all, of the characteristics of the default, that doesn't mean that they too don't feel the tension between being themselves and fitting in. It doesn't mean that they actually fit every requirement, or that they need to fit every requirement of what is normal. And maybe someday, if we stop making things defaults, we can all just be ourselves.
No matter what or who you are, there's a light over at the Frankenstein.
So obviously culture has changed a lot since 1975 when this film was made. For one thing, the language we use to talk about some of these things has changed a lot. And for another, the conversation now tends to focus on representation. So let me be clear. I'm not claiming Frankenfurter is good representation, not of any of the letters under the big rainbow umbrella. I mean, he doesn't have the greatest grasp on consent and boundaries, for one thing. So while I would never claim him as a model for the future, what Frankenfurter is, from his pearls down to his sparkled heels, is an out-and-out challenge to the outdated, old-fashioned model of the gender binary.
Just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania.
And that, my friends, is beautifully, gloriously queer.
I believe the subtext here is rapidly becoming a text.